Welcome to this third meeting. I would like to thank you for being here and also to thank Fondazione Campostrini for hosting this third meeting. But especially I would like to thank Professor Cheetham that is come directly from Birmingham, from England, just to participate in these conferences. Professor Cheetham is the head of theology at Birmingham University. He's a philosopher of religion. His main topics are interreligious dialogue and interfaith movement. And he wrote and edited 6 books. And among them, probably the main works are John Hick, that is a book about the thinking of John Hick, the John Hick philosophy, and Ways of Meetings. This our meeting, this third meeting, is devoted to process theology, a very fascinating and distinctive approach coming from the philosophy of Alfred North Whitehead and Charles Atchell. The intention of this meeting, of this paper, is both to introduce its main aspect, providing just a brief introduction of its main key points, and also to focus on a particular process case, namely the problem of evil. Moreover, we will deal with some criticism made by process theology to the concept of omnipotence, of divine omnipotence, and its reconsideration of the divine attributes, with a reference to the pantheistic relationship between God and the world. Finally, we conclude with a brief examination of the advantages but also the difficulties that are involved in this approach, anticipating some problems that will be addressed in the next meeting. But before introducing process theology, we should ask ourselves why process theology? So the question is, what makes it so different from other theological approaches? There are 3 main reasons that make process view relevant and worthy of attention. First, it proposes an innovative point of view from which to conceive the traditional divine attributes and relationship between God and the world. This means, in other words, that process theology offers new opportunities to solve all the theological and philosophical problems, such as the problem of evil. Second, the criticism to the traditional concept of omnipotence point out some problems and inconsistencies inherent to this notion that too often is considered and is uncritically accepted and considered as a sort of unquestionable notion. Third, we should remember the relevant role that process theology has in contemporary theological and philosophical debates. So, let's start with with the criticism to the traditional concept of omnipotence that is one of the main features of process theology. Process theology denies the traditional notion of omnipotence, namely the concept of all-determining, all-controlling power. According to this view, this notion lies on a fallacious argument, which implies the acceptance of the idea that a creature can be totally determined by a being other than itself. So, the problem lies in the meaning given to the concept of omnipotence. In fact, if this means a being having the greatest conceivable power that is possible for a being to have, this is clearly a tautology, and so it's acceptable. But if it means this implies the idea of a being able to bring about any state of affair that is logically possible, so it is considered unacceptable. Why? Because in order to accept this sentence, this notion, it's necessary to accept the following premise. It is possible for one actual being's condition to be completely determined by a being's or beings other than itself. The fallacy lies exactly in this acritical acceptance without any metaphysical investigation regarding the nature of these actual beings. So, according to many process theologians, we should reflect on the essence, on the features of worldly beings on which God's power is exerted before accepting the notion, the traditional notion of divine omnipotence. According, for example, to David Ray Griffin, that is one of the most famous actual theologians, process theologians, there are no experiential bases to support the idea of beings that are totally determinable by God. Our experience reveals us the existence of beings having power to determine ourselves and parting to influence others. But we have no direct experience of powerless entities. So in the world, there are no actual beings devoid of power. The concept of a total powerless entity, so, is without experiential grounding and is meaningless. So, for the reason, on the contrary, we have direct experience of entity having power. And the first experience is the experience of ourselves as entity with power. This kind of experience provides a basis to support both the notion of a being with power, and on the other hand, in this way we can recognize an analogous power in things other than ourselves. So, in other words, the notion of omnipotence, the traditional notion of omnipotence, is rejected by process theology, since it's considered fallacious, so it's considered based on a fallacy. But, on the other hand, process view proposes a different notion of omnipotence, according to which God has all the power that is possible for a being to have in relation with an actual world. So, our containing by metaphysical necessities a multiplicity of entities is a world in which a being cannot have the monopoly on power, because creatures possess the inner power to determine themselves and others. This notion will become more clear when we examine the next section of this speech, and when we analyze the concept of creatio ex nihilo and creation out of nothingness, or creation out of chaos. So, according to process view, there is a logical problem in the concept of divine omnipotence. But on the other hand, there are other philosophical and theological difficulties in the traditional theism. So now I suggest to examine probably the most famous form of theism, the free will theism. The free will theism contends that God maintains the monopoly on power, but he has given the power of self-determination and other determination to some creatures, especially human beings. God's aim, according to free will theism, is the development of moral and spiritual virtues through the free comparison with obstacle and hardship in life. But in order to fulfill God's aim, two conditions are necessary. First, theological freedom. It means freedom vis-a-vis God, the freedom to sin, the freedom to choose or not to choose God. On the other hand, a system of fixed natural laws is necessary in order to reach God's aim. In fact, a world containing natural laws allows us to exercise our rationality, our knowledge. But there are another important aspect in free will theism. In fact, according to this point of view, God is the original source of any power in the world. This means that creators have only a delegated power that comes directly from God. Moreover, God has created the world ex nihilo, out of nothingness. So it has determined the basic structure of the cosmos. And here lies the first problem. According to process theology, it's possible to raise a question. Why has the world this basic structure? God could have created a world similar to the actual one, but devoid of destructive natural disaster or terrible disease. Moreover, to consider human moral growth as God's moral purpose doesn't explain, for example, animal pains and the evolutionary process. Given the divine ability, it is another difficulty to abolish or to revoke the power to self-determination and other determination. Why does God not intervene in the world, at least in some extreme cases, in order to prevent terrible evils, terrible events, such as child rapes and murders, etc.? God has the power to revoke our freedom, so it's able to intervene in the world. Why does God not do this? This is the important question. Finally, free will theism, at best, is able to justify the presence of moral evil in the world, but it cannot explain why horrible natural evil exists, since they don't depend on human deeds. So, in conclusion, according to process theology, the classical notion of divine omnipotence is unsatisfying, and so it's necessary to change perspective. And for that reason, now we'll deal with the first theme, probably the most important aspect in process theology. I mean, the rejection of the notion creatio ex nihilo. Process theology rejects the Jew-Christian doctrine of creatio ex nihilo in favor of the notion of creation out of chaos, according to Whitehead philosophy. So there is a clear metaphysical framework behind process theology. God brought the world out of an initial chaotic state. He shaped the cosmos according to some eternal metaphysical principles and categories, with the aim to prompt it toward the highest level of beauty, harmony, and complexity. The original stuff which composes the world is not considered as a passive, static, raw material in God's hand, like a sort of clay for the potter. Instead, it embeds creativity. This is a central notion in process theology. Each thing in the world, from electrons to human being, is an embodiment of creativity, of this creative power. This concept of creativity is twofold. It is the power of self-determination, or final causation, and is the power to determine or to influence others. I mean, the power or the ability of efficient causation. The power of final causation, of self-determination, implies the capacity inherent to each thing in the world of determining itself through approaches called concrescence. This process of concrescence consists in the unification or inclusion of the various feelings and data experienced by a being. Thanks to this integration, the entity becomes a unified subject. In other words, when a being receives some feeling, some data from other beings, from the environment, it is able to create a fresh synthesis, personal, creative synthesis of these feelings and data in a unified experience. And in this way, according to process view, it became a subject. When the process of concrescence is completed, the creature ceases to exist as a subject. It perishes and transmits some data and feelings to other beings, becoming an object of experience for them. This is the moment of efficient causation. So, according to process view, we are able to influence others since we are object of their experience. So, if we look at the moment at these two processes, it's clear that according to process theology, there is an essential relatedness at the basis of reality. So, any beings is relational, it's in its inner nature. There are not individual separated substances interacting at an external level each other, but interaction belongs to the inmost nature of things. So each thing is relational in its essence. Okay. But at this point, some clarification are necessary. First, creativity is not a being or a power in the universe that coexists with the divine power, a sort of cosmic being in opposition to God. Rather, creativity is the primordial power that is embodied by all creatures, God included, and cannot exist apart from these concrete embodiments. Moreover, creativity is considered as an ultimate metaphysical principle inherent to the nature of things. So, it doesn't depend on God and is beyond His will. This is very important because it marks the first difference between process view and traditional position. In fact, God, according to process theology, cannot unilaterally bring about any possible state of affair in the world, because beings in the world have their inherent power of self-determination and other determination. And this freedom, this kind of freedom, is not a divine gift. Doesn't depend on God, but depends on the nature, on their nature, on the nature of things. So, in other words, while the traditional God, if he wanted, could intervene in the world, for example, to prevent some evil, some negative events, process God cannot do this because beings in the world have their own freedoms that doesn't depend on God's evocative power. So God doesn't possess a coercive power, but he has a persuasive power, defined as the capacity to prompt actualities or beings, actualities terms used by process theology, to indicate beings, toward their best possibilities. This divine act of persuasion is expressed in the initial aim that a creature receives from God. So God, who is able to envisage the best opportunity for a being, gives to it an initial aim, initial purpose. But the aim, the beings involved, it's able to choose or not to choose to follow the divine initial aim. So there is a sort of dichotomy between the divine aim and the subjective aim of that creators. These two aims can be identical, but also can diverge one from another. Now, let's see another important notion in process theology. I mean, the concept of beauty. Beauty is the union of harmony and intensity of experience. The more an experience is harmonious and intense, the more it is good. So, an experience is intrinsically good in itself, regardless of its usefulness, if it is characterized by beauty. God's aim is to prompt beauty in the world, is to lure the world toward the highest form of beauty. At the opposite side of intrinsic goodness, there is intrinsic evil. Intrinsic evil is intended in two main senses: disharmony and triviality. Discord or disharmony refers to an experience in which elements are discordant and conflict each other. For example, in the case of mental physical sufferings. While triviality, this is very important, can be defined in terms of boredom, banality, lack of novelty and excitement, and is considered a genuine evil by process theology. In order to increase intensity and avoid triviality, because triviality is an evil, so we should avoid evil, it is necessary to increase the complexity of one's own experience, introducing new details and particulars. There are two related ways to improve intensities by means of complexity. First, a being can absorb, can prehend more feelings and data from other beings, from the environment. Second, it can simplify in a fresh and new synthesis these new acquisitions, these new data. So the acts of prehension, the acquisition of new feelings, and synthesis, so the ability to synthesize, to sum up these new feelings in a new system, in a unified system, introduce novelty in the world. But there is a problem. In fact, during this process of appropriation, of increasing experiences and increases feeling, and a being could not be able to organize this new acquisition, these new feelings in an harmonious way, feeling discord. So, discord is considered intrinsically evil and occurs when two or more elements in the experience are in mutual contrast, producing conflict and pain. For example, in the case of a new experience, of a new feeling that we had in our personal life, in our experience, and that we are not able to harmonize with other past experience. A possibility to avoid disharmony is to refute to integrate new contents in one's own experience, maintaining the previous harmony. But in this way, the entity risks transforming its experience in a banal, boring experience. If you remember, process theology consider triviality a genuine evil. More specifically, triviality is a relative evil, considered bad only by comparison. This means that an experience is evil only if it is more banal than it have to be. So, for example, an experience of animal is not considered evil just because it's less complex than the human one. But if the human experience degenerates to an animal level, then it considers evil. So, an experience is not trivial in itself, but only compared with the possibilities and ability of the creator involved or considered. This notion of triviality as genuine evil is very important, and we will see why when we deal with the problem of evil. In fact, here I can anticipate some aspect of this. The definition of triviality marks another important difference between the process view and the traditional approach. In fact, the traditional approach focuses mainly on the problem of sufferings in the world, in process terms on the problem of disharmony, of discord. But he doesn't care of the problem of triviality, of the presence of triviality. While process theology considers triviality as an evil. And so, this is the reason why God brought a cosmos out of the primordial chaos. In fact, in a chaotic situation, beings occur at random, and there are very, very banal experiences. And in order to improve, to increase harmony, to lure beauty in the world, to urge the world toward a new and complex form of intensity and harmony, is necessary to bring order into this initial chaotic state. Linked with this notion of beauty, there is another important concept in process theology, the concept of metaphysical principle and so their correlation. There are, according to process theology, some principles, metaphysical principles that are eternal, necessary, and changeable at the basis of reality. In fact, if process view reject the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing else. So this implies that there has always been a world containing a multiplicity of beings. And if worldly entities are not created by God, then there must be some metaphysical laws, some fixed laws that are at the basis of their mutual interactions. According to process view, there are 5 variables. First, the capacity for intrinsic goodness. That means the ability to enjoy experience, to enjoy positive experience, to enjoy beauty. Second, the capacity for intrinsic evil. That means the ability to suffer, the capacity to suffer also great pains and great suffering. Third, the power of self-determination, or in other words, freedom. Fourth, capacity for instrumental goodness. And 5, the capacity for instrumental evil. They means the ability to influence others in a negative or in a positive way. So to influence others for the good, for the bad, for you. Let's see the first correlation. The first necessary correlation involves a correspondence between the capacity for experience enjoyment, positive enjoyment, and the power to self-determination. To enjoy ever more intense feelings requires the ability to integrate ever more complex and different data in one's own experience. Namely, it requires freedom. So, this first correlation explains why in the world exist creatures with a very high level of freedom, such human beings. In fact, without an increase in freedom, in the ability to synthesize in a free and new way some data and feelings received from the world or from other beings, an increase in intrinsic goodness, in the ability to enjoy ever more complex experience, would not have been possible. Therefore, God decided to bring forth beings with a great amount of freedom in order to improve the possibility for a greater enjoyment. That's the second correlation. The second correlation regards the capacity for intrinsic goodness and the capacity for intrinsic evil. The more the capacity for intrinsic goodness improves, the more the capacity of suffering disharmony increases. Let's think of a very complex nervous system like ours. It makes us able to enjoy marvelous feelings, but also to suffer horrible pains. And these two possibilities are strictly linked, are strictly correlated each other. A third correlation is between the capacity for intrinsic goodness and the capacity for instrumental goodness, namely the ability to positively influence others for the good. A complex entity, beings, able to enjoy harmonious and intense experience, has a great power to contribute to the good of other entities. So, an improvement in its capacity for enjoyment involves an increase in its influencing power. Let's think about us. We have a great power to influence others for the good because we are very complex beings. More complex than, for example, an electron or, for example, just a dog. On the other hand, there is the opposite side. There is a strong correlation between the capacity for instrumental evil and for intrinsic goodness and the capacity for instrumental evil. I mean, the ability to contribute to the evil of others. An entity able to enjoy complex and intense values is also able to negatively affect other entities, hurting or destroying them. A human being is able to do good things for others, but also, for example, to kill another human beings. Now, we have seen the basic concept at the basis of process theology, and I would like to discuss another important notion developed by Charles Alston, that it could be considered the father of process theology. The concept of dipolar theism. According to process philosophy, God presents a double nature, an abstract or absolute dimension and a relative dimension. The divine perfection consists in these two aspects that make God superior to all other beings, but also superior to himself, so self-surpassing. Alston defines this notion as dipolar theism because it contains the existence of two different poles, but strictly related poles, in the divine nature. From one hand, God presents a primordial nature, so he is superior to creatures in the world, but in all aspects, and possesses an abstract or absolute character that reveals itself in the divine justice and divine omniscience, for example. So, in other words, God's side of relation with the world is fixed. He always responds with perfect power, love, and wisdom, apart from the content to be responded and regardless of the actuality or the possibility of a being. So his attitude towards the world entities and the world in itself is always an attitude of perfect knowledge, of perfect love, care, and justice. So it's a fixed modality to relate with the world. On the other hand, God shows a consequent nature. God is considered self-surpassing. His perfection is not unchangeable, totally independent. On the contrary, God is deeply related with the world. He feels our joys and suffering and integrates them in his own experience. So, every moment God acquires new experience and feelings. Therefore, he surpasses himself at the level of the richness of the variety of his personal life, of his personal experience, thanks to his ability to perfectly acquire everything occurs in the world. Alston defined this double divine nature in terms of reflexive transcendence. The adjective reflexive stands for the relational, participative essence of God. The term transcendence is used to mean superiority, as superiority with relatedness. God is superior to all other beings, but he retains an element of sociality, an element of dependence. This is clear, a panentheistic position. Why? Because it contends that God includes all beings in itself, but is not identical with the world. So, God is superior to the world, but is able to feel all the experience, all the feelings that happen in the world. This conception of divine sympathetic responsiveness is another important difference between process view and traditional theism. In fact, according to traditional position, the divine love is always considered as a sort of a creative will, a will to do good things for us, to take care of us. But on the other hand, God has always been considered as a sort of impassive, indifferent deity, unable to feel, to participate, to share feelings with us. On the other hand, process theology embraces a panentheistic position, according to which God participates in every single moment, in every single experience that happen, in the same way as we feels our body. And so we flourish if our body flourishes, and we suffer if our body suffers. Now, there is no time for seeing this, so I leave this for discussion. And the last notion, important notion in process theology, I mean, the notion of divine love and knowledge. According to the polar theism, God is immutable in power and also in love. If you remember, Arshon says that love, care, justice, omniscience is a modality, fixed modality, a divine modality to relate with the world. But on the other hand, the polar theism condemns that God can grow, can change, and so is dependent on beings in the world. This is because even if God's loving attitude toward the world is considered a part of his primordial nature, an important dimension of love is to be happy for the joys of others and to suffer for their sufferings. So love is defined as a sympathetic participation. At this point, a question might arise. In fact, if good happiness changes with the changes in the experience, in the joys of others, does this involves that God is not perfect knowing? Should God not be able to know everything that happened and that will happen, so to know in advance anything that will occur in the world, so joys included? So what about divine omniscience, divine knowledge? According to process view, perfect knowledge doesn't mean a perfect anticipation of future events in their minimal particulars, but it means a perfect adequacy to the object known. So, God doesn't foresee every single event that will occur. His knowledge of the future is nebulous, vague, not precise in details. But on the other hand, once an event happened, God is able to know and retain in each aspect, without any loss or loss. This means perfect adequacy to the object known. This means that the divine omniscience is able to know every single particular of beings of event that occurred in the world. In other words, the divine omniscience is not defined as the capacity of knowing in advance all the details of future situation, but as is intended as a perfectly adequate knowledge of the past and present things, while the future ones are known in a precise, not totally defined way, according to their nature, to their essence of unsettled, undecided events. So there is a sort of double dimension in God's knowledge. The divine knowledge belongs to God's primordial nature, so it is the eternal fixed modality of relating with the world. On the other hand, the contents of this act of knowing are mutable, flexing, and dependent on the experience and choices made by creatures in the world. So, at this point, I would like to discuss with us a particular process case, namely the problem of evil, that is the problem that interests us in this meeting. According to process theology, problem of evil is threefold. If you remember, disharmony and triviality of experience are considered evils, genuine evils. But there is another kind of evil, the worst kinds of evil according to process theology. I mean temporality or perpetual perishing. the loss of memory of positive and valuable experience by means of which evil is overcome. This is the definition of temporality. So, according to process theology, the problem of evil regards temporality, regards the fact that nobody can retain forever memories of our life or our experience, that the good experience by means of which we can defeat evil experience, we can defeat a negative experience, simple fade away. But before deepening this last aspect, let's see some central question about the problem of evil. A traditional, classical question about evil is, why there is evil in the world? Why? Process theology is able to solve this question, to answer to this question, because its answer lies on the metaphysical correlation in the world. So, due to necessary metaphysical correlation existing among creatures, the possibility of evil is unavoidable, is a necessary possibility. The capacity for intrinsic goodness is strictly linked with the capacity for both intrinsic evil and instrumental evil. So, the more complex is a creature, the more it risks suffering intense pains, as well as the more a creature is able to actualize itself in a complex way, the more it is able to willingly cause sufferings to others. So, in other words, the problem of evil is considered not a necessity, but a necessary possibility in the world due to the presence of metaphysical correlation. Second question, why does God not intervene to prevent evil in the world? This is another classical question about the problem of evil. Again, process theology is able to give an answer to this problem. God is not omnipotent in the traditional meaning, and the constitutive freedom possessed by beings gives them the ability to perform bad deeds and to diverge from the divine and initial aim. So, according to Artshon, the problem of evil is a false problem, is a false problem. It's a false problem because it's based on a misinterpretation, on the misunderstandings of the divine concept of omnipotence. So, this concept must not be considered as a all-determining, all-controlling power. So God doesn't coerce because he wants to respect the freedom of its creators, but just because he cannot do this. He cannot do this because evil just arises from the various freedoms that conflict each other, and God cannot avoid this possibility. So from one hand, there is the question or the aspect of metaphysical correlations, metaphysical necessary correlation that makes evil a possibility. On the other hand, there are the problem or the aspect of the freedom of creatures that is not a divine gift, so it doesn't depend on God. Third question, why did God not leave the world in its original state? In this way, he would avoid the occurrence of suffering and pains. So the question is, why didn't God not decide to leave a world in a chaos, in a state of mere chaos? Why he decided to bring a world out of this chaotic initial state? God, in order to avoid, this is the answer of process theology, in order to avoid the evil of disharmony, couldn't lead the world in a state of mere chaos, because this is a very trivial condition. And if you remember, triviality is considered a genuine evil that a perfect good must overcome. So the necessary triviality is a genuine evil, and it must be overcome by God. It's quite clear. God cannot allow the presence of evil in the world, of triviality, so trivial evil in the world. For the reason he decided to bring a world out of chaos. So, if you think just one moment about the traditional questions about evil, we can see that process theology seems able to solve from its metaphysical framework, from its point of view, the traditional problems of evil, these traditional questions. But according to process view, there is another relevant questions about the problem of evil. I mean, could the enjoyment of good experience justify evil? So, if the real question doesn't regard the reason why evil exists, anyway, if all the positive value is enjoyed, and this is the question, all the positive value and enjoy are worth the possibility of occurrence of suffering and pains? This is the real question. According to many theologians, there is a solution, an answer to this aspect. And their solution is an aesthetic solution. I mean that according to this position, our existence and all evils that are contained in it, referring to the possibility for us to experience a minimal degree of positive values in every moment of our lives. So, the positive values in this world are worth the risk of evil, because there is always the opportunity to enjoy valuable and good intrinsic experience which can overcome the negative one. So a minimal degree of positive and valuable experience can justify the presence of evils in the world, according to process view. And now let's see again this concept. But if you remember, there is the problem of temporality. That is the worst evil according to process view. So there is another question that still remains that regards the problem of perpetual perishing of temporality. I quote just two brief sentences from Artshorn, a government historian, Common Griffin, that are two important process theologians. What destroys in our maturity the zest of our youth is not so much the discovery that injustice, suffering, and anguish are a part of all life. It is the realization that the moment of joy in which these evils are overcome fade into dim memories and are finally lost altogether. So the problem is now, how can occult good overcome evil, the evil of temporality? There is an answer also for this. The divine love, which keeps in itself all the moment of our lives, is able to defeat the final evil of temporality, giving meaning and significance to life. According to Common Griffin, this meaning lies in the fact that both in our own enjoyment and through our adding to the enjoyment of others, we contribute everlastingly to the joy of God. That means simultaneously that we are safe with God. Now I explain the meaning of this sentence. So, in other words, God is able to retain all events in memory thanks to his omniscience. If you remember, the process definition of divine omniscience is a perfect adequacy, a perfect knowledge, a perfect adequacy to the object known. This implies that God is able to remember each thing that happened in the world in all its own particular. So, process God is not only all-embracing, but all-retaining. He stored and eternally keeps an experience in his memory. Nothing is lost. So, due to the fact that God's memory always retains everything without lack or loss, our existence represents an eternal and imperishable contribution to the divine life. Our immortality doesn't consist so in a sort of eternal, personal, and life after death or afterlife, but in the permanent and incorruptible value that our existence acquires into God's life. Arshon defined this everlasting life in God, objective immortality. We haven't, or we will won't have a life after death, a personal life after death as a subject, but we are object of God's memory. We are memory for God. So our lives, in all their aspects and dimensions, are eternally retained by the divine memory. But Is this enough, this to overcome evil? According to process theology, this is not enough. It's not enough that we are eternally remembered by God to overcome evil. In fact, it's necessary another moment, another divine act. I mean the act of divine synthesis. So, the meaning of our life doesn't lie merely in God's memory, but in the act of divine synthesis. So, we, God, participate and respond to our life experiences, creating a synthesis or unity. So God doesn't limit himself to passively receive negative experiences, but he actively prevent and transform them. His act of transformation doesn't undo the evil character of a fact, but it is able to integrate negative values into a wider perspective, the divine one, transmuting evil into goodness. So there is a work of transformation, of transmutation of evil into goodness in the experience of God, so in God's experience, in God's life. But on the other hand, the overcoming of evil occurs not only in God's experience, but in the divine act of providing ideal aims to next stages of the world. So what does it imply? Imply that if God surpassed or defeated evil only in its private dimension, this would be a very selfish act, because this doesn't imply the world. It doesn't imply an overcoming of evil in the world. But process God is able to overcome evil in the world. How? In this way, he provides new opportunity, new heart, new promptings to the world in order to restore God, in order to defeat the evil that is happening, for example, negative events, and providing new opportunities, new possibilities to enjoy complex and intense and harmonious feelings. In grieving words, for an evil fact to be overcome by good in God means for it to be transformed into an ideal aim which can serve to overcome evil in the world. So, and now time is running out, so I must conclude. Almost 1 hour, so yeah, I must conclude. I will see with us some last aspect of process theology. We have seen some main aspects, main themes in process view with particular attention to the problem of evil. And we have seen that process theology is able to give a solution to all the traditional questions about evil and about the notion of God from a different perspective. But a question is, what are the advantages of this position? And what are especially the difficulties of this position? In my opinion, there are many advantages. First, the reduction of the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo allows process view to define the problem of evil as a false problem. We have seen Archon definition of traditional problem of evil as a false problem. Moreover, the definition of the divine omnipotence and the presence of metaphysical necessary principle at the basis of reality makes process theology able to affirm the presence of genuine evil without denying the goodness of God. So, from one hand, evils are considered concrete evils, real evils, not merely prima facie evils. On the other hand, God is justified. Evil doesn't depend on God's will, because God does its best to overcome, to defeat evil, and to prompt the good, to prompt beauty in the world. Moreover, process position doesn't fall in the same difficulties that the traditional theism presents. For example, it has not to give any explanation for the presence of sufferings or animal sufferings in the world, because it doesn't depend on God. Or, for example, it hasn't the problem to explain why natural evils happens in the world, like, for example, terrible disease or natural disaster. Nor it has to give an explanation for the presence of horrible evil, of this theological evil. Moreover, it embraces a different conception of the divine nature, closer to the biblical and Christological teachings that describe God as a loving, cherishing Father. This concept of the divine love receives so, in this way, a new meaning which combines the creative aspect, namely the creation of good things and the overcoming of evil, with the relative dimension. But, and with this I conclude, there are also problematic aspects in process theology. Now briefly let's see what. There are three main aspects of difficulties in process view. First, the problem of individual evil. Is the aesthetic position really satisfying? It is enough to justify the possibility of the occurrence of evil, referring to the positive values that can be enjoyed. Process good seem more interested in prompting beauty in the world in general, from a general or global point of view, tend to take care of the individuals. His love appears to be a consequentialistic love, concerned with the global improvement of the world, not with the individual pains, with individual problems that are considered as a sort of negative side effect of creation. Moreover, it could be asked if the possibility to enjoy a minimal degree of experience in every moment of life is enough to justify the vast amount of sufferings undergone by humans and animals, for example. Second, there is the problem that regards the worshipfulness of process God. Is a non-omnipotent deity in the traditional meaning worth of being worshipped? And is the traditional concept of omnipotence really incoherent? Finally, and in my opinion, this is the most important difficulty in process theology. Process theology lacks an eschatological and soteriological personal dimension. The fact that God is able to overcome evil in its own experience and in the world is not enough, because God is unable to give, to restore the God in the personal life of the sufferers. What's about the personal, individual sufferings? There is no restoration, there is not an overcome, because there is no an afterlife, a subjective afterlife, but there is just only an objective afterlife. But, so, in conclusion, this soteriological dimension seems totally lacking in process theology. Now, my speaking time is running out, so I conclude here, and I give the floor to Professor David Cheetham. Thank you for your attention. Okay, just this? Okay, perfect. Sparkling or natural?
Natural. Well, thank you very much. When Sofia asked me to come and talk at this particular conference or this symposium about process theology, I had to think twice about what I would say or what particular approach I should take. Because I have to be honest, is that a lot of what I've done hasn't looked specifically at process thinking necessarily. But what I've noticed in some of the work that I do on interfaith and pluralism is that some of the latest thinking in this particular field seems to have some resemblances or resonances with process thinking, some of the ideas that are implicit or that can be found in pluralistic thinking about other religions, has tried to find different kinds of spaces to describe the meeting of religions. And if I was to describe that, there's been an attempt in recent thinking to move away from the grand system of how do we interpret all the religions. And some of you may be familiar with the thinking of, say, John Hick or Karl Rahner, great, huge systematicians who create these massive systems into which all religions fit, the grand meta-narrative. And instead, there's been a movement away from that in some of the recent approaches of, for example, comparative theology that's been represented by Francis Clooney at Harvard University, but also with scriptural reasoning, which is a movement that's found in Cambridge, and also in Birmingham. We're doing a lot of scriptural reasoning in Birmingham. And one of the things that seems to be attempted by scriptural reasoning and by comparative theology is to find liminal spaces to concentrate on the local, on the occasional, on the momentary, on the provisional, and then to deliberately not ask questions about where does this fit in. So if religions meet, if there is an occasion of meeting, if people of different religions feel connected, one isn't trying to find an overall global philosophy of religion to explain that. So it's the denial of the explanation. Part of the problem, allegedly, in working out how religions meet has been this creation of the grand system to explain what's happening when religions meet. And so what I'm trying to explain here is that in some of the recent directions of interfaith, and my example this afternoon to you, in the time that I've got, will be scriptural reasoning, because it's the movement that I'm most familiar with. And scriptural reasoning has a number of people who are very articulate, very sharp, based in Edinburgh, in the University of Virginia in the United States, and also in Cambridge, that are seeking to find what they call a wisdom, sapientia, in the meeting of religions, rather than knowledge. So we're not trying to learn a new global religion. Instead, we're trying to be wise about how we handle our own religions. And so the emphasis is not on strong ontological thinking or commitments, but instead upon the provisional, the occasional, and the spontaneous, and the relational and the creative. And these are ideas which, as Sofia was mentioning in her paper, are resonant with some of the process thinking that you see in thinkers like Alfred Whitehead and Charles Hartzell. Now, Sofia's particular example is the problem of evil. But just to confuse you and give you even more to think about, I'm looking at the problem of religious diversity. So you'll have far too much to think about, I promise you. If you want to read about this, there's a really good book called The Promise of Scriptural Reasoning. It's really the only major text that's been published. It was published in 2006. And it contains a series of articles and chapters that seek to explain this new idea of how interfaith takes place. So I'll read a bit from my text as well as talking to you directly. So whilst being an interfaith movement, scriptural reasoning, it consciously moves away from liberalism. It doesn't like the thinking of John Hick necessarily. And it can be characterized, therefore, as a post-liberal movement. And it seeks to attend to what it calls an intratextuality. It's translating it into, okay, fair enough. It seeks to describe an intratextuality in the meeting of religions. And I would say its tendency is to prefer unprescribed outcomes, unresolved encounters. And the main person associated with it is this man here, who's a Jewish philosopher based in the United States called Peter Oakes. And he was heavily influenced by the process ideas of C.S. Peirce, who is an American philosopher, was an American philosopher. In many ways, some people argue that Peirce deserves greater recognition as a process thinker than maybe Whitehead does. And the emphasis, therefore, that Oakes brings out is this emphasis on intratextuality. So he says one of the problems of the meetings of Muslims, Christians and Jews is that pluralists like Hick come with external agendas, like a Kantian ethic, and says all religions should follow the categorical imperative or something like that. That is an extra textual interest. It's brought in outside the traditions to which all the religions have to agree. An intratextual approach asks what are the primordial sources of these religions. And Oakes said the source is the text, or the source are the scriptures, the Talmud, the Quran, the New Testament. That should be the proper starting point, therefore, of the meeting of Abrahamic religions. An emphasis, therefore, not on liberalism, i.e. the liberal theologies of Schleiermacher or John Hick, again, but rather to do with the texts. And what do the scriptures themselves say? So what are the sources of Islam? It's not Western Enlightenment philosophy. What are the sources of Christianity? Not Western Enlightenment philosophy, but the New Testament or the Quran. And then when you get Jews, Christians, and Muslims together, you have what Oakes calls an inter-Abrahamic meeting. An inter-Abrahamic meeting. And he says that one of the problems of trying to solve religion in the public sphere is this tendency in the West, certainly in North Anglo-American philosophy, to think in binary terms, either or, this or that, plus or minus, instead of thinking in more triangulated or triadic ways, which are more, as I say, spontaneous or difficult to pin down or prescribe. And so scriptural reasoning is a kind of a mystical meeting. It's not trying to determine what happens when religions meet. It's wanting to describe an actual occasion of meeting. It says they do meet. So that's it. There is a phenomenon of the meeting of Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And we resist the temptation of labeling that meeting by saying this is the real in operation behind religions, or this is the incognito logos at work, or this is the Spirit of God at work. Instead, we just say, never mind, they just meet. And so there's an appeal just to an occasional relational moment without seeking to draw any building blocks upon that particular meeting. And this is what Oakes is trying to encourage. He thinks that if you're going to bring real healing and repair to the world, you have to stop thinking in terms of binary logics, of good, of bad, of polarities, but rather you think of occasions, repeated meetings, friendships that can generate a better future. So how did it all start? Well, it started about 1990s at the American Academy of Religion. And it started with Peter Oakes getting Jewish scholars to talk around a table like this about the Talmud and to reason about religion on that basis. And then at those meetings, a Christian philosopher, Christian theologian called David Ford and another one called Daniel Hardy, they're British theologians, said, why can't Christians take part in these Jewish discourses? Can we bring the New Testament to the table as well? And so the textual reasoning seminars expanded and became known as scriptural reasoning. So there we are, textual reasoning expanded into a Jewish Christian meeting at the American Academy of Religion. And then in the late 1990s, Muslims came along. and said, well, can we bring the Quran to the same table? Because the Quran contains similar things, of course, to the Hebrew Bible, but different kinds of stories. And sometimes they would change the scriptures around. They would have a Christian read the Quran or a Jew read the New Testament and see how it was interpreted by these different religions. So what is it about? What is it trying to do? Well, scriptural reasoning, its key ideas are to find idioms that are better attuned to religious particularity. It argues that the Enlightenment ways of talking are the wrong idiom. The idea of reducibility of religions to concepts like ethics or truth or propositions is unhelpful. Instead, there needs to be a much more particular starting point. And that particularity for scriptural reasoning is, as I've said, the texts. It seeks to, therefore, it can't achieve knowledge. That's impossible. If it attempts to achieve knowledge, it does so by trying to give articulation to concepts and truths which take you away from the scriptural midrash, a Jewish concept of free-flowing hermeneutics and interpretation. And if you're going to allow midrash in interpretations, if you're going to allow a Christian to read the Quran and interpret it to a Muslim, and all the other variations on that, then what do you produce? The scriptural reasoners claim that they're not trying to produce anything. They're not producing an Abrahamic religion, for example. They're not saying that this is the same God. That's surprising, because you might imagine that one of their claims would be that Christians, Muslims, and Jews worship the same God, so let's meet. No, they just say, these are our texts. So arguably, Hindus or Buddhists or humanists could bring their key text to the table and hear the others interpret it. That's what I would argue anyway. But this is about occasionalism. It's about relationality produces truth. It's rather like it resonates, therefore, with the process idea that the fundamental reality about God is not some Greek onto-metaphysic, but rather it's a relationality, a Trinitarian perhaps in the traditional way, a relationality that takes place within God. And so the scriptural reasoners are saying that what that produces is not knowledge, but wisdom, a kind of and it's interesting because what they talk about is that as you meet regularly with Christians, Muslims, and Jews to discuss scriptures, you may start to disagree even more. It doesn't produce agreement. But somehow, if you meet regularly, 6, 8, 10 times, it produces a relationality. It produces a wisdom. It produces an understanding that is not based on consensus. It's not based on agreement. But it's like a Heideggerian idea that it sets up its own world. There is a world of meeting. And it's a kind of a relational world that is based on that moment and that occasion. But they don't want to say, now we've found the ground. It's not neutral ground that's between the religions, but mutual ground. They share the Abrahamic texts, something like that. And so the aim and objective of scriptural reasoning is understanding, not consensus, friendship above consensus. So you might say that today this has been a scriptural reasoning. You've had your arguments, but you've remained friends. That's scriptural reasoning. You may disagree with your Muslim, your Jew friend, or your Christian friend, but the epiphenomenon of the meeting has produced a wisdom. And that's what they focus on. And it seems to me that by doing that, they're moving beyond a commitment to ontological or clear static binary ideas in theology. They're actually finding a space in creativity that isn't determined by theology. It's very interesting that Sofia talked about creatio ex nihilo. In some ways, that idea is located, maybe this is not the same then as process, because it seems this idea is that outside of God, there is a creative space that even God allows to be. That's the miracle of creatio ex nihilo. It is itself. And it seems that that's what I would argue scriptural reasoners are producing through the meetings. They're producing a creativity, a moment of meeting that isn't absorbed back into the theological. It isn't taken back into the grand system of the theology of religions, but rather exists outside of it as a creative moment of exploration. And it's interesting that the meetings of scriptural reasoning look like this. You invite people, a Muslim, a Jew, a Christian, usually they're scholars, and they sit around a table for 10 weeks and they argue a lot about religion, about their particular beliefs. And it generates, therefore, a sense of knowledge which is not based on the scriptures themselves. So I have written an article that was published a couple of years ago arguing that it's not the texts themselves that are valuable, but the occasions of meeting that in the end that are more valuable than the texts, than the scriptures themselves. Yes?
Just one question. For me, it's very important to understand. In which language are they reading the book?
The original.
The original.
Arabic, Greek, Hebrew,
Okay.
Aramaic.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
But that's a good question, because the main challenge for scriptural reasoning is, what do you do with it in the civic world? It's a very academic approach. So it took place at the American Academy of Religion. And the audience would hear Arabic, Greek, and high discussions about the nature of a text. The recent manifestations is more civic, reading them in their translation.
Yeah.
So in Italian or English or whatever. Yeah, yeah, that's right. Okay. So I've given you a summary here of the rationale of scriptural reasoning. Scriptural reasoning, SR, is a practice of group reading of the scriptures of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that builds sociality amongst its practitioners and releases sources of reason. It's interesting, just stopping there, that they talk about Christian reasons, Jewish reasoning, Muslim reasoning, but they don't talk about reasoning with a capital R. So don't be fooled about reason. For them, they use the term deep reasoning, and they mean the depths of the scriptures, that sort of thing. Builds sociality amongst its practitioners and releases sources of reason, compassion, and divine spirit for healing our separate communities and for repair of the world. Thus, scriptural reasoning theory aims at a scripturally reasoned triadic response to the problems of the world that is motivated and sustained by the healing and divine spirit of Scripture. So it's an intratextual area of familiarity, whereas the Enlightenment philosophers like Hick and other sorts of grand metaphysics, German idealism or whatever, is foreign, they argue, to the reason and spirit of Scripture. So they prefer what's called a midrashic style of scriptural reasoning. And there's a scholar called John Berquist, who is based at the Claremont School of Theology in California. And he says that what you find is in biblical studies, there is very little discussion about process theology. Why? Because he argues that biblical scholars are committed to the traditional theistic metaphysics. They're committed to the scriptures revealing traditional truths. And they believe, therefore, that the scriptures are the absolute source of all authority. A lot of biblical scholars that he's acquainted with anyway. But John Berquist argues for a process reading of Scripture. And he says that therefore you see a text not as a divine manuscript dropping from the sky, but rather as a co-created piece, something that is produced by an organic interconnection between the writer and God, a co-creativity, a dynamic complexity. Now, arguably, it may be quite difficult for biblical scholars. It's certainly, I would argue, impossible for Quranic scholars, as you will see in a minute, to accept this scriptural promiscuity that's being advocated by scriptural reasoning, this midrashic style. But if it's going to be a meeting of religions, not just single scholars looking at their texts, then this process view might be a very useful approach. It might be emphasizing interrelationality, co-creativity between the participants. And if that's at all valid, then it produces something. It produces not a body of knowledge, but it produces an effect. Now, this is interesting. What we can observe right now is that what do you do with scriptural reasoning? So all these people, they meet around tables, they talk about scriptures, they do it in public. So you could go to the American Academy of Religion and attend a scriptural reasoning occasion. You'd all be sitting there and watching scholars in front argue about the meaning of Adam or the meaning of Moses or something like that. Well, this is it. It's the importance of the occasion of experience. And so some scriptural reasoners have said that this is a return to the use of drama and performance in philosophy. The role of the dramatic, the role of theatre, the necessity of play. Gadamer talked about the audience as being the fourth wall, participating playfully in what was being the hermeneutical world that was being set up. So maybe we're in phenomenological territory here in determining what do we do with scriptural reasoning. But notice, though, that the occasions of meeting are very much like what Whitehead was talking about. As Sophia was saying, Whitehead talked about concrescence, which he means that sometimes experiences can be so vivid, they give off something, or they become real by the nature of the relationality that's produced those moments of concrescence. Very complex, obscure idea. And he also talked about, therefore, occasions as being units of concrescence. So maybe the process view describes very well a moment of an occasion of experience that takes place by observing scriptural reasoning well done. And so the scriptural reasoners have to be expert performers. Philosophers need to be performers. They have to perform a meeting. They have to perform a text in order to have an effect. And if you think about it, if scriptural reasoning is less about producing Abrahamic knowledge and more about producing the wisdom of meeting, even in disagreement, then the importance is experience. It's a kind of an empirical necessity. It can't be rationalistic. It must be phenomenological in its effect. So it seeks to extend wisdom, to extend the meeting around scriptures. So scriptural reasoning presents itself as a possible solution to how do you bring religion into the public sphere. It addresses, therefore, it's at the heart of a discussion, certainly in the British tradition, about the place of religion in a post-secular politics. What does post-secular politics look like? I don't know whether this is a discussion that's relevant to the Italian context. I'm not sure about how strong the religious presence is in your society. I think looking around, it's a bit more, slightly, present in Italian society than it is in British, or certainly French society, with very, very robust forms of secularism. And so you could argue that scriptural reasoning is only an imperative in highly secularized societies where the question is, what do you do with the religious other? How do you bring that into the discussion? Do you force religions to the margins? But if you let them back in, how do you bring them back into the public or the political sphere? And what the scriptural reasoners suggest is that the failure of contemporary politics is to try to bring the Enlightenment into religion, to try to control the religious impulse, to police the sublime, to give it clear boundaries. And the response of the Enlightenment is to say, well, what is the respectable form of religion? Why should we include religion into the public sphere? Surely it's better off left out. And the scriptural reasoners try to address that by saying, we can give you a form of reasoning that's rational, that's based on the scriptures, and therefore is a good way of delivering interreligious dialogue in a secular world. So they present alternative reasonings, not Enlightenment reasonings, but scriptural reasonings. The other one criticism, though, at the very bottom of here, is whether actually, again, it may be this case in Italian society that maybe Italy is more religious, I don't know. But certainly in Iran or Saudi Arabia, the issue is not how to bring religion into the public sphere, because religion is already very much in the public domain. So maybe one criticism of scriptural reasoning is it's claiming to do something that's only sensible in very highly secularized societies. So it speaks about wise meetings. It speaks about meeting in the third space, meeting in the occasional space, the moments of meeting. Another criticism is that we professors are all very good at talking about third space. We're all very good at imagining these sophisticated, liminal, experiential, mystical zones. Maybe we're getting a bit too clever in trying to describe these very minute, wise meetings. Would the common people understand this carefully worked out description of the meeting of religions without any content, merely a frisson of experience between the religions themselves? So is it all in the professorial imagination, the third space? But effectively, it claims that one of the mistakes made in theology and philosophy when applied to the study of social sciences is the mistake of binary thinking, to think that theology and philosophy either has to do things in either or ways. That's too ontologically restricting. Instead, sociality and, they argue, the interpretation of text take place in the middle, in medias res, in the middle of the event itself, not at the beginning or even at the end, but right there in the moment. And that is a different kind of theology. It doesn't come in the form of huge volumes of systematic theology. It's much more, it takes place as a dynamic in society itself. And so really it's claiming that the whole basis of theology and philosophy has to take place in a flux. It generates, therefore, again, not bodies of knowledge as such, but moments of occasionalism, which have to be performed, and we have to think of dramatic ways to influence society in that way. So, Peter Oakes, who is the Jewish instigator of scriptural reasoning, describes what he calls abductive reading. So rather than reading texts from a set of propositions or from a set of dogmatic starting points, one starts out of life. And you hear that when you put your scriptures in the hands of somebody else and ask them to interpret it to you. And so the scriptural reasoning group say that there are surprising readings that take place in the hands of the other religion reading your scriptures. These are abductive readings where they describe their experience of your scriptures from the middle of their own lives as a form of their occasion and their moment of engagement. And the argument, therefore, is that if you use this kind of reasoning, this kind of encounter, this kind of engagement, more than the grand metaphysical systems of explanation, you start to repair reasoning. You start to repair reasoning where it takes place, in media res, in the middle of things, as opposed to at the beginning or at the end. There are different spaces the scriptural reasoners describe. So the question is, where do you hold a scriptural reasoning meeting? And they describe 3 different spaces. The first one they describe as the house, which is the homes of the scriptures themselves, the mosque, the church, the synagogue. And they say we can't hold scriptural reasoning in these fixed areas of interpretation, the worlds in which they inhabit, because they're already owned in a power dynamic by that particular tradition. So why not meet in the university instead? Why not meet on the campus? A campus is another space. That particular campus is Birmingham University, if you're wondering where that campus is. But the problem with the campus is it claims to be a neutral space. Certainly at Birmingham. Birmingham is a secular university. When I give my lectures on theology, I cannot end my lectures with Amen. If I did, I'd be sacked, because it's meant to be a secular space. But in that sense, the campus is potentially a problem for scriptures. It's potentially a difficulty for scriptures. And so what they argue that they should do is describe the meeting of scriptures or scriptural reasoning as a meeting in a nomadic temporary space, which they describe as the tent, namely tents of meeting. So wherever there are unfixed occasional meetings, how would you describe the buildings in which a scriptural reasoning meeting takes place? Well, it's like a tent. It's a temporary structure. It's not a house or a campus, but it's a meeting in the midst of temporality. So what are the initial inquiries to make about this? Well, there are unprescribed random outcomes. One of the difficulties, as I've said, with scriptural reasoning is it's difficult to say which direction does it go in. So if Muslims, Christians and Jews meet around their scriptures, and if they have a random occasional experience, a frisson of meeting, then what direction of travel is that? Is it good? Is it bad? The scriptural reasoners say we have increased the value or the depth of our disagreement, but we've become better friends. Is that a good direction? Can you build upon that? So some of the scriptural reasoners have asked the question, what do you build from scriptural reasoning? What is the systematic passing on to the next generation of scriptural reasoning? Do they have to just experience it for themselves? Again, some of the concerns are also the Islamic concerns. Is the occasional nature, the flux of meeting, a kind of hermeneutical promiscuity? The Quran allegedly has fixed meanings, scriptures that are given to give truth. Therefore, the meeting around text just to discuss and to increase friendship, is that a foreign territory, an unacceptable space for the Muslim? But what can we pass on to others? How does it work? I think I've talked a lot, so I'll leave you with this to think about. We've also got to think about the problem of evil and suffering. There's a great writer called Nicholas Adams, and I recommend him to you. And he writes about scriptural reasoning a great deal. And he says that understanding between members of different faiths actually happens. And so he says that scriptural reasoning if it had a grounded metaphysic, a clear commitment to religious truth with a capital T, ontological commitments, then we would want to describe the meeting as being an Abrahamic meeting, or describe the meeting as having a ground, like a Kantian ethic behind it. But he says, forget that, don't do that. Just say, it actually happens. People actually meet, and something happens. And that means that scriptural reasoning doesn't come along with a filtered, reduced, or diluted version of the different scriptures, but rather scriptural reasoning allows people of radical different religious beliefs to come into the same room. So normally, interfaith dialogue is practiced by liberals of different religions, arguably. People who are already committed to a liberal vision. And so certainly in England, interfaith is associated with a more liberal dynamic to one's religion. So therefore it tends to isolate or to alienate evangelicals, traditional Catholics, fundamentalist Muslims, Orthodox Jews. But it includes all the liberal aspects of those religions. So the argument is that by not trying to describe or to do an overall explanation of the meeting of religions and just say, come along and discuss your text, anyone can come. And one of the fascinating things about scriptural reasoning is that people with very strong commitments, fundamentalists, come to scriptural reasoning to disagree. But after 10 meetings, they start to have friendships. They start to have understanding and not consensus. And so the second quote on this up here, scriptural reasoning practices an emphatic taking as true metaphysics and tries to cure itself of any tendencies towards grounding metaphysics. What does that mean? A Muslim, a Christian, and a Jew take as true their scripture. That's their metaphysic. My Bible is true. My Quran is inerrant or infallible. What doesn't happen is they don't say these are all scriptures according to some universal category into which those scriptures fit. Therefore, there is some external extra-textual judgment about the validity of a text. So a taking as true metaphysics is just to say, take them at face value, these particular texts, and don't explain the ground. These meetings actually happen, and they work. I'm going to leave it there. Because I know there's lots to discuss. I don't know how long will they go on for? 5 o'clock. And there's more. There's evil to discuss as well. So there we are. So you've got a lot to think about. Thank you very much.
Okay. So thank you for your attention. And if you have any questions, just ask. And if you prefer to put your question in Italian, so no problem. Ask in Italian, then we try to translate for professor, and the same for our husband, so it's okay.
I have some questions for both of you, but I will start with Dr. Chita. I don't understand. Which is the main goals of these kind of meetings? Is a social goals? Is a public goals? Is a theological goal? Because I understand the social utilities of these kind of meetings, of course, but in terms of theological wisdom, it's very hard to bring people and speak, because even inside the religion there are a lot of differences. So I'm studying, for instance, the Old Testament text in Hebrew. I'm trying to understand Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, and from Hebrew to Greek and Latin translation is a universe. Is already a universe. So, which is the goal of this? Which is the main goal of these meetings?
That's a fantastic question. And it's a good question because it's very difficult to answer. Is it a theological outcome, or is it a public outcome, or a social outcome? The key for these practices is wisdom and performance. Now so it's a very interesting question about, does it produce a theological advance or theological change? I can't say it does. And if it did, it would alienate the participants. They would feel, they're asking me to compromise on some belief. So what's so fascinating about, and what's so controversial, is that they want to have wisdom emergent from the meetings without writing it down. And so it must be public. If you, I'm immediately thinking about what do we do with scriptural reasoning. The writers are highly intellectual, and so like lots of professors, they're very impractical. The practical outcome, it seems to me, it must be performance. It must be to see expert improvisers of interpretation.
So should be expert people that are...
Well, if you think about take improvisation, a musical improvisation. Yeah. Well, yes, a jazz player. A jazz player is not a bad musician. In order to be a good improviser, they have to know the rules brilliantly. And so yes, that's interesting. The scriptural interpreters have to be good in order to be midrashic and explore. But the interesting question is, does it produce theology? It can't. It exhibits it, I think.
Io chiedo scusa, però porrò le domande due in italiano, perché pranzo e mia incapacità e stanchezza sono tre componenti che mi impediscono di spiegarmi bene in inglese. La prima, molto diretta, è un fenomeno che riguarda solo le tre religioni abramitiche, okay, e non ha possibilità di essere allargato dal punto di vista scritturistico, perché appunto parla di scrittura, anche ad altre forme religiose che hanno testi sacri. E la seconda, che è quella che mi sembra più spinosa, è questa. Ho compreso, tento di sintetizzarla il più possibile. Mi sembra di aver compreso che fondamentalmente l'obiettivo non è l'accordo teologico, bensì una forma di pratica di comprensione reciproca che permette l'incontro di questi luoghi comuni, e questa comprensione permette una sorta di, se mi è concesso dire così, solidarietà, no? Di amicizia, di entrata in una forma di comunione. La mia domanda è, detto questo, quanto funzionale sia realmente? Esempio, la famosa guerra nei Balcani, Jugoslavia, quanto queste persone che vivevano insieme e avevano luoghi comuni ogni giorno, da un momento all'altro si sono ritrovati come nemici e hanno combattuto l'uno contro l'altro. Può veramente, è una splendida ipotesi, una splendida proposta, e però non so fino a che punto regga allo scontro poi dei valori, weberiano quasi, insomma.
Traduco, volete raccogliere le domande?
Okay. We collect answers and then I translate for you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to both of you for your wonderful presentations. First, Professor Cheetham, how does a scriptural reasoning group begin its meeting? Does someone decide the subject matter of the meeting before the of the group before the meeting?
Let's take some answers and then we can collect other questions.
Yes, I start with Stefano. Sure. Stefano asked you two questions. First, he asked if this is scriptural reason is a phenomenon that regards only the Abrahamic religions, or if it can be extended to other kinds or other forms, religious form or other kinds of religions. Yeah. And second, it's the most important question, I think, and if the aims or the proposed is not theological in kind, but is a sort of practice of mutual or reciprocal understandings.
Yeah.
The question is, how does it work? How does it really work? From a concrete point of view, let's think about the problem of wars, for example, in Yugoslavia, wars fighting. It happened that people that live together, that coexist together peacefully, from suddenly became enemies and start fighting one against another. And so it was considered a marvelous idea, a fantastic idea, but does it concrete works in given the political, social conditions and influence?
Excellent questions. 1, 2, 3, yeah. Is the phenomenon only for Abrahamic religions? Very good question. I remember 5 years ago, we did scriptural reasoning in the Great Hall of Birmingham University. And we invited Christians, Muslims, and Jews to address the question, what is a good city? Birmingham is not a good city. Verona is a lovely city. So bad start, no. But we invited Hindus, Buddhists, Zoroastrians, and they were sitting along a table with 1,000 people watching. And the Hindus said, my religion is not text, it's guru. The Buddhist said, my religion isn't text, it's flux, it's the non-being. But they were happy to use their texts in order to not upset the mutuality that was on their table. So they adopted texts, they adopted the discourse. But there was a discussion then that what do we mean by texts? And so there's a purely literal reading of a text, but then there is a text in a postmodern reading, which is merely to describe a world or a set of traditional terms of reference that have no external disruption. The sources are the starting point of that tradition. So it may well be that the text of Hinduism, it might be meditation or Buddhism. There might be a generation of experiences around that text. Now that is an answer that's a sleight of hand, in the sense that I'm semantically dodging your question, arguably. But I suppose, this is my question, is what's more important, the meetings themselves or the texts that generate the familiarity? So really the texts are there to generate the familiar so everyone feels welcome. So I suppose, I don't know, it's rather like cigar smoking. Everyone enjoys the cigar. It's a familiar, so everyone who smokes enjoys each other's company. That's a text. You know what I'm trying to say? So you have a familiar phenomenon. Yeah, but which is not a... now, is the Enlightenment reason, the age of reason, is that a text? Well, it is for some, but it may be a foreign discourse imposed upon those traditions. So it's to get rid of the imposition. Whatever is not imposed must be the text, I presume. That's one answer. How does it work? Like that. So I was going to give you an example of indirect effects. The idea that by... What are the effects of the drama or the performance? Can you have ripples on a lake? It's a terrible... But this is the question, rather like what you asked. Is it too academic? Is it the professorial third space? What do we do with those spaces is a good question. So I don't know the answer. Maybe it's just intellectual frisson. How does it begin? All the people decide what they'd like to talk about. So they all agree to talk about, say, Moses or Adam or judgment or city. So it's an agreement, a proposal of all the people to agree on a topic to discuss, and then they begin. That's how it starts.
Thank you. First, I do wish to thank Professor Cheetham and Sofia for the very, very interesting lecture. Two questions. The first to Professor Cheetham, very, very short, and the second more complex to Sofia. When Professor Cheetham was speaking, I have remembered a great phrase, sentence by Gregorius the Great, Scriptura crescit cum legente. Do you think that there is a link with the experience on the movement and this phrase, Scriptura crescit cum legente?
Yeah, sorry, I'm illiterate.
The Holy Scripture grows with
Okay, yeah, nice. Yeah, I see.
Mm.
No, they wouldn't. Yeah, I'll ask that first. And yeah, they don't believe to add to Scripture if that's what's meant. There's no additional Scripture. They only bring in the taking as true metaphysics. So you bring your text to the table that is the holy text. So there's no attempt to adjust the text, but one hears different readings of the text. I suppose that is what emerges out of the meetings, either disagreement about interpretations or agreement, or more likely friendship through repeated discussion. So it doesn't. So that sounds really woolly and ill-defined, but not building new scripture. Scripture does not grow greater. No.
Okay.
Anyway.
Sophia, my question is about the concept of omnipotence in God. I remember that 50 years ago, an English theologian, Dunstan, I don't remember the name, Dunstan, wrote a little book about one of the major theologians of the 19th century, Frederick Denison Morris, and the title was Morris, a digger still. Why? Why Dunstan thinks that in theology, the first weapon to use, the fittest weapon, is not the razor, the trouser, the cut off, but the dig. Best theology is a digging in the Holy Scripture, in the Christian tradition. Now, it is not better following this author. It is not better instead of cutting off the concept of omnipotence in God to dig into it a more deep meaning, a not idolatrical meaning, human to human, Nietzsche would say, a notion of omnipotence, not idolatrical. In fact, when we speak, common people speak about omnipotence, suddenly what people has in mind is the coercive power of a great manager, of a great politician, of a great general towards his army, nation, industry. Surely God is not omnipotent in this idolatric meaning. No? It is omnipotent in a way which man is apt to despise as weakness, the cross, kenosis, the self-humiliation, as the only means by which God has a superhuman power to produce splendid word of the English theology, atonement. We have not in Italian this word, atonement, to be at one between man and man and God. And I conclude it may be remembered that Dostoevsky, in Brother Karamazov, spoke, I translate in English, of the fearful strength of humility. That humility that habitually is misunderstood as weakness.
Yeah, sì, good question. Thank you for your interesting question. It's a very interesting question and is at the heart of process theology. I don't want to make the apology of process theology because I don't think that it needs, but a process theologian answer you that process theology exactly does what you ask. I mean, according to process theology, the concept, the divine concept of omnipotence does not be cut off, but does be reformed, transformed. And so he rejects the traditional notion of omnipotence, but don't give up the notion of omnipotence. He tried to transform, to change, to deepen it, to dig in the meaning of omnipotence. So yes, they change, they completely change. Because it's a great change, it's a great leap. But on the other hand, they try to maintain the concept of omnipotence, but from another perspective. The question is, it is enough? It is satisfying? And this is another problem, is another question. And you ask me if it's too anthropomorphic, probably. That's right, this notion. I don't know. I think that, sincerely, I don't know. I cannot answer you, since I think that both concepts, traditional concept, process concept of omnipotence, have many problems, many difficulties, since it's clear that the traditional concept of omnipotence, it's very difficult. It's very to maintain, to contain, to support. There are many problems that it involves. The presence of evil is one, probably the most clear aspect. On the other hand, process view contains this different notion that, yes, it's fascinating, and it can be also be sustained from logical point of view and from sort of, say, coherent reasoning. But I don't know if it is enough. Probably it's too anthropomorphic because it's very similar. They try to destroy the gap between God and human beings. They try to bridge this gap. They try to make a God closer to human beings. But the risk is transforming God in a superhuman, in a heroes. And so, yes, there's a big risk involved in process theology. But I don't think that it's right to say that they cut off the concept of omnipotence, or that they refuse to deepen this concept. Because, for example, there are many debates among Genesis, among the first sentences of Genesis, just to demonstrate that process concept of omnipotence, it's proof that there are proof is based on scriptura. So there are scriptural bases to support this meaning. So they don't simply give up the Bible and everything. Absolutely, they try to demonstrate that their approach is a true Christological approach. This true Christological and biblical approach.
Process theology would agree with, I remember, John Hill and William James,
Okay.
which spoke of a finite God.
Finite God.
John Hill in three essays on religion and William James.
Yeah.
And for process theology, we must speak about a finite God.
Infinite God.
Finite God.
I don't think so. I think that according to process view, process God is not finite. It's not finite as in human beings. Is close to human being. It feels our joy, feels our suffering. But anyway, shows a primordial nature that makes him other
with regard to human beings. So I think that we cannot think of finite God. We can think or speak of finite God if you intend with these words a God that is very close to human being, that is able to share their feeling. In this meaning, yes, I can say. But otherwise, for example, in the figure of Christ, Christ is a clear example of finite God. Yes, in this meaning, yes. But in the meaning of a sort of a limited God, they cannot accept this. Thank you.
I don't see the relations between the two perspectives. So I see them as two opposite ways to answer to the same political question.
Traditional and...
No, process theology and scriptural reasoning. The political problem is the coexistence of different religions in the same public space.
Yeah.
This is the fact. This is a political problem. So we have two modalities to answer, to face this problem. The Enlightenment attempt to found a state without religion is failed. So we have two ways. One of these, to propose a new theology, a new religion maybe, a new global religion, encompassing the other's religion and proposing a static God and enjoyment as a soteriologic, as something that has a soteriologic role.
Yeah.
The other one is to promote practices as scriptural reasoning, in which we can try to have a concrete dialogue between different religions to have a mutual understanding and a mutual comprehension and a mutual familiar feeling. So I prefer the second one, no, but I don't think that scriptural reasoning is like a process thinking. I don't understand.
I see the resonances. For example, one of the polarities or dipolarities in Whitehead's thinking is that God is substance and creativity. And also there's an emphasis on the occasion. There's also an emphasis on what relationality builds. So you're right. The scriptural reasoners don't describe it as process thinking. In fact, when they see the YouTube, they'll probably be horrified that I'm calling it. But I'm drawing connections. It's an unacknowledged sense of a reversion to a different way of doing theology that is almost bashful or embarrassed about the strong, static, ontological versions that seem to dominate the discourse. And so the search for the liminality resonates, echoes with some of the objectives that you find in process thinking. But it's not a process movement, no.
Damiano, could I reply you or you prefer?
Okay.
If you want, you can solve after, so you can.
Okay.
For me, the same.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to answer?
Okay. Yeah, come on.
I know.
Yeah, it's probably it was my fault because there is not enough time to explain the metaphysical framework on which process theology is based. That is action philosophy and Whitehead philosophy. But according to these metaphysical frameworks, all beings, all occasion, actualities is the term that they use, are the basic unity of reality. And the characteristic of this main feature of these beings are the essential relatedness. So everything in reality is deeply connected. And so everything is in process. So there is a dynamic system. There is continuous changes, continuous meeting, constant meeting. And probably this is at the basis of
Latin basis of scriptural reasoning. So, what is the main aim of scriptural reasoning? It's to promote friendship, it's to promote relationship. So they are not interested in building grand theologies, systems, but in promoting friendship and relationship. And this is exactly what process theology and process philosophy contains. The idea that at the basis of reality there is relationship. So scriptural reason is a practice to... Okay, it's clear. Okay.
So questions to both. To Sofia, I have a very superficial knowledge of process theology, so just a question to understand better. Two passages actually. One is when you say that there is that enjoying, I don't know if I'm correct, but enjoying intrinsic goodness is goes necessarily together with freedom. So
Sorry, God? Sorry.
Goes necessarily together with freedom.
Yeah.
So my problem is to understand this necessarily, because I can understand that enjoying intrinsic goodness can go together with freedom, but I find very difficult to understand why enjoying intrinsic, I cannot find an example, for example, how enjoying intrinsic goodness go together with freedom. I can easily, in an easy way, think to examples in which just the opposite, is enjoying goodness goes together with the absence of freedom. And the second one is about temporality. So when you speak about temporality as a perishing, perpetual perishing, because my problem is that I have the impression that temporality is in a way intrinsic to the logic of exercising powers. So I mean, a way out will be to say that temporality, there is another temporality that is not perpetual perishing, and that's not evil, it's not an evil, and that's compatible with, I don't know, with God making things. But if not, if this perpetual perishing aspect of temporality is always there in temporality, I don't see how a God could have powers, even limited powers, without implying temporality, and so that's my problem. And to David Cheatham, so I will join the Daniele's question about the beginning, because I have the impression that the picture you gave of this person joining these seminars, it's the picture of person who are searching, who are curious of others, or are searching for something. They are not, they consider that their sapienza is not full or completely satisfied, I don't know. And even the example of the interpreter, or the example of the musician, the improviser, are all examples of people that are expecting from outside something to come and to better, or I don't know. And I think that that's quite good. It's a good picture in comparison with men in general. I don't know if it's a good picture in comparison with religious men, because religious men have a very specificity, and that is that he has he has absolute views. And in absolute views, I don't know if you lost curiosity, but it's quite easy to imagine that you don't need to be open to. Probably you are not curious, you are not open at the beginning, so you feel that it's not important, and that's why. That's one point. But the second one, I think, is more crucial, more problematic, is the fact that texts, because you can say, why not playing football or doing I don't know, cooking seminars, so it's a way to meeting, and no, but text, it's not it's important that are texts. So, and the problem with texts in religious traditions is that there are at least two aspects of text that makes a big problem. And one is literality. That the fact, for example, in one religion, God blesses always with the left hand.
Yeah, yeah.
That's literal. It's not just a way to say something other, something. So it's not metaphorical, it's literal. And the other one is performativity. It's one of the specificity of religious texts, that they are performative. And how can I understand without consensus if I take seriously these two aspects, literality and performativity of texts? It will be easier in a way to have consensus without understanding, to join other people from other religions in practice doing liturgy. For example, there are experiences in interliturgy. I found more easier in a way to have consensus without understanding than understanding with consensus. If we start from the text and if we understand that the specificity of religious texts is also at least literality and performativity.
You go first. Yeah. You had two questions.
To collect, or probably it's better that we answer and then.
What do you, I think we have another question here.
Okay.
Understood. We had quite a few questions there, actually. So, do you want to?
As you prefer.
Would you like to answer?
Yes, but I can recollect his
Okay,
answer
fine.
and then.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, mine is a question about method. I'm speaking with Sofia.
Method?
See,
Okay.
yes. It seemed to me that this process theology try to apply the human logic and the human ethic to God, not the opposite things. Start from the human being point of view and try to build a theology, trying to put God into this kind of system.
So it's anthropomorphic?
Yeah,
Okay.
quite a lot.
Anthropomorphic ethics?
Yeah.
Okay.
Is for you right to use the logic to build a system about God? I don't know if I'm clear. Could you speak about God, supposing that he's act like you, in the same way that you would act?
Okay.
For me, is a big problem. It's a question of method. That's the question.
Okay.
I hope to be clear.
Okay, so thank you for your question, because in this way I have the occasion to explain better some notion that I couldn't explain because there was no time. So you asked me about the necessary correlation between enjoyment and freedom. According to process view, the divine aims is to promote beauty in the world, and so to prompt ever more complex, intense, and harmonious experience. So an experience cannot remain at the same state. A being cannot enjoy ever, always the same experience. Otherwise, its experience will be transformed in a very trivial experience. If you experience every day the same things, it's boring, there's a lack of excitement. So in order to avoid this problem, in order to avoid the problem of triviality and to prompt so intrinsic goodness, I mean ever more complex enjoyment, it's necessary freedom. Why? Because freedom means self-determination, the ability to transform and to create new synthesis every time. So every day you create new synthesis because you are a very complex being, and so you create new synthesis starting from your experience. So more experience acquired, more complex synthesis are possible. Okay? So
freedom is necessary to create. Yeah.
Freedom is the only way to have new synthesis.
Yeah.
So there are no new syntheses in the world. It's not happening something that makes a new complex situation.
Because according to process view, self-determination is necessary to bring novelty in the world. Without freedom, there is no novelty. There will be only occasion will happen at random in a chaotic way. And only freedom can bring novelty, not God. Beings, only beings can bring novelty in the world. God had them. God given beings an initial aim in order to help them to produce in the world novelty. But novelty cannot happen in random. Okay, or in the world, it's possible that it happened, but it couldn't be experienced by a being, so it's not useful. Because the most important thing in process theology is experience, is enjoyment. It's clear? Okay. Second, about temporality, it's very important. Okay, I think that, and it's my fault, sure, there is a sort of a confusion between temporality in the common sense and temporality or perpetual perishing in the process view. Temporality doesn't mean that one thing happens and then perish. This is the normal condition of the world, and according to process view, it is an avoidable, sorry, I'm quite tired, an avoidable dimension and aspect of this world. So an occasion is born, then develop, and then perish. And this is not a problem according to process philosophy, because it's a necessary condition of our finite and limited conditions of beings. So it's impossible. On the other hand, the problem is not so temporality in itself, or the perishing and the perishing of the self, but the fact that nobody is able to remember us. This is the problem. So we live and then die, but nobody will retain us eternally. And so all our efforts, or our experience, or our positive enjoyment simply fade away. And this is unacceptable for a process theologians. So all must be remembered. So in conclusion, from one hand is a normal condition that everything changes, because at the basis of reality there are relationships. So there are continuous dynamic changes. So these changes implies temporality. It is unavoidable. But on the other hand, God must be able to remember all that is happening. Otherwise, everything will be unuseful. Because if the most important thing is the enjoyment of positive experience, for God, but also for us, because otherwise, what is the meaning of our life? Yeah, but according to positive view, if you enjoy a good experience, okay, and then you die, and there's nothing, and nobody will remember you, nobody will remember your effort to. Is also, yes, but also in some way a your problem, because one of the main important aspects of your life is that you must help others. You must contribute to the maximization of the good of others. And if nobody remember you, nobody can friend you, nobody can have any feelings for you, because you're died and nobody remember you. And nobody can, you couldn't become an object of experience for another beings. Or you could be in the actual moment, in the immediately future, but in the long future, you couldn't be. Let's think, for example, of great saints, of great heroes in the history. If, for example, in a terrible atomic nuclear explosion.
That's a new synthesis that is not up to my freedom.
Sorry?
That's a new synthesis that is not up to my freedom. Remembering, God's remembering.
It's a new synthesis, but you contribute to this new synthesis. Without you, this synthesis would be impossible. Because your experience are determine this synthesis, in part determine this synthesis. On the other hand, there are the syntheses coming from beings that apprehend you, and also gods, naturally. So yes, the main aspect is about God. But on the other hand, there is the question to remember positive experience. Okay. About logic methods, it's too anthropomorphic. I think, yes, I think this is a problem. I'm not sure if it's too anthropomorphic or not. It's similar to the question that you asked me. If it is possible to, I think that one of the main efforts of process view is to change perspective from the traditional. They feel that the traditional perspective is too not anthropomorphic. So it depicts a distant God, and they cannot accept it because it's not a God that can be served, can be literally served. We cannot do nothing for God. On the other hand, the risk behind the process notion is to transform God in an anthropomorphic deity. And this is a risk, but anyway, they can maintain, and we should remember this, that God is not a being in the world. So God is different from all beings in the world because he shows a primordial nature. So it's totally different from us. So there is a dimension of ulteriority or otherness that belongs only to God. And we cannot become as God. God cannot share this dimension with us because we are beings, finite, limited beings. So the dimension of mystery, the dimension of ulteriority and otherness is maintained, but so is abstract character, and for some aspect also incomprehensible aspect is maintained. But on the other hand, this doesn't mean or doesn't imply that we can share something with God. And in some way, it's very similar to Christian teachings. So Christ is God's son, so he is like us from some aspect, but he also is another.
The Christian teaching came from the scripture. The
Yeah,
whole scripture.
but they
came from logic.
No, they based their reasoning from philosophical sources, but also from the Bible, because they say that.
They are using the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's my fault because there is no time. I try to say. They used the Bible. There are long debates about Genesis, about the creation of nothingness, creation of cows, and so yes, they used Bible. They interpret. They believe in the Bible. Believe in the Bible. Absolutely, they believe in the Bible. They use the Bible as an important point of reference, but they try to interpret the Bible from a philosophical point of view, from a philosophical framework. Okay.
Just quickly to address your question, you talked a bit about is scriptural reasoning seems to have the common person as a searching person. This talk about sapientia, wisdom, and that sort of thing. And you asked a very provocative question about whether this searching man, a normal man, was the same as a religious man. Very good question, but I would say that's not addressed, in my view, as I understand it, to what the expectations are of the participants in scriptural reasoning. They're not searching. They're there to meet, to discuss. And the literality is no problem either. They don't all interpret their readings differently. They don't bring in metaphorical readings where necessary about the left hand of God or whatever you describe. Rather, it's a meeting of people who are there who have agreed to meet. They said, yes, I will come and discuss. But what allows them to participate is the lack of a prior agreement. They don't have to serve a prenuptial saying, I agree to sell away my Christianity or my Islam. And so in that sense, they're not searching individuals. But it may well be that after the 10th meeting or the 11th meeting, they've made a kind of a friendship, an understanding, which is difficult to describe in a concrete way or substantial way. It's more of a phenomenological experience of an occasion as I've described it. Very good question about I describe the scriptural reasoning as an expert gathering. That it is true. And in some ways, the the practice of it is challenged by that. But I wondered if, I recently wrote an article where I explore that. And what happens a great deal in interfaith is a discussion of people from the grassroots. I don't know if you've heard that term, the grassroots, i.e. the common people. That's where interfaith should start, allegedly. Well, why not start with the representatives? That's the often ignored group, those that are the iconic exemplars of a particular tradition. And in fact, if you think about the dynamics of how social groups are affected, often they do have the exemplar, the excellent person, the representative, who can act in a vicarious way and influence others. So it may well be, again, exploring the idea of theatre and performance and drama, and improvisation, that we aren't talking about the common interpreter, but we are talking about exemplars, expert representation.
Just because one point is not there, it's the question of absolute views. Because it would be more if each religion has one vision that does touch the other. So if I have a vision that touches just Christians, if I'm Christian and I have a vision about Christians, so I can understand even probably, I don't know, the Muslim position, what the Muslim says about his text, and okay, but not only a Christian has something to say about the Muslim has something to say about the Christian, that is working. It's not just a possibility. That's a very, very, very important thing. It's like to love your mother, I don't know. And it's in this way, it's very, very strong. And in this way, the conflict, I don't know.
That's it. There are no conditions for participation, so they come with their absolute views. And I could have shown a YouTube clip of scriptural reasoning, and you would see a very hot, fiery scriptural reason meeting where a particular reading was being given. Take, for example, the question in the Quran whether it's Ishmael that's sacrificed or Isaac. That's fundamental. And seeing two different interpretations between two people who have got the Palestinian question on the horizon is a deeply potent absolute meeting. But I suppose the scriptural reasoners then are saying that this is interesting, they say that they hope over repeated meetings to improve the quality of disagreement, which is a strange misnomer, the quality of disagreement, as if somehow people learn a wise way of dealing with disagreement. That's the epiphenomenon, rather than being whether you need to come up with a theology that is literalist or non-literalist or metaphorical or not, or absolute or not absolute. Those are not conditions for participation, because the production of scriptural reasoning is not articulated in those ways.
How would you act if
Non c'è problema. Okay. Yet another question on the traditional notion of omnipotence. It's a scriptural question. Maybe it concerns both of you. Okay, I may be wrong in my reading of the Exodus narrative, but what seems to me is that God is trying to make Moses and people believe in him in reason of the exhibition of his outstanding powers. If this is the case, probably the traditional notion of omnipotence is not negotiable by a believer in a Abrahamic tradition. What do you think about that? And how do process theologians address Exodus narrative and a reading like this, and what have to say?
Can I just, there was an excellent quote from Dostoevsky, I think. How do you describe absolute power? Because there's a scriptural term that says, my power is made perfect in weakness, to describe Christ. So the power of the cross is found in the defeat of the cross. I wonder how rich the concept of omnipotence actually is. If you describe it in terms of the parting of the Red Sea, that's power. But if you describe power in terms of the defeat of sin on the cross, and the how did the kenosis of the divinity that became a man, is that power in a different form? And so I wonder how fluid actually the concept of omnipotence might be, biblically.
Yes, it's a good question. It is negotiable, the concept of omnipotence, traditional concept. According to process theologians will say you that your view is comes from cultural conditioning. So you reason this way because you are accustomed to reason in inside a traditional framework, inside a traditional perspective. But their concept of omnipotence does not imply imperfection, does not imply weakness. It doesn't mean that God has the perfect power, the most conceivable, the greatest conceivable power for a being to have. So according to them, their concept, it's perfectly coherent, just because God is perfect in power. So it's exactly what God said to Moses. Io sono colui che sono. I am what I am. I am what I am. Mm-hmm. Okay, is right?
I am that I am.
Okay, okay, yeah.
Or future, I will
yeah,
be.
it will be. And so God is perfect in power. They doesn't reject this, but they tend to transform, to turn out this concept in a more consistent and logic, coherent concept. So I cannot think that. I agree with you. I agree about the fact that many religious people will have many problems in accepting this non-traditional concept of view. But probably it is determined by a cultural conditioning. So from a cultural influence upon us and upon religious people. It's not a question of Bible, because Bible could be interpreted in different way. And so the same heaven, the same images, in this case God that reveal itself to man, could be interpreted in a process view. Does that make it? It's clear? Okay.
C'è una domanda?
Sì, se ci tengo.
Ma sì, dai, tanto oggi non chiude stasera la conversazione.
I would like to stay with Karamazov. Is the greatest book ever wrote. So, Ivan Karamazov said almost at the end, even if God exists, I don't want to stay with Him. Yeah. I don't want. Yeah. If I accept a philosophical and logic way to think and understand God, this is total. Right, it's total logic. Say, okay, I arrive to understand all the logical and coherent way that you want to use to explain God, but still, I don't want to stay with Him, because I cannot accept, I don't know, the dead children in front of me.
Yeah. Okay.
Is this possible?
With process theology?
Yeah. Is the process theology like... porge il fianco a questo tipo, only in Italian, to this kind of thinking?
I think no. Because, have you finished, sorry?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry to interrupt. I think no, because Karamazov, Ivan, rebels against the traditional concept of God, of the traditional omnipotent God that had created the world out of nothingness. So yes, in this case, Ivan can say, I don't want to stay with him. Yes, my ticket. Give my ticket for the paradise. I don't want this ticket. Yes, he can, because God had determined all the basic structure of the world. And so he permits evil. But in the case of process theodicy or process theology, it's not a matter. It's not a problem, because God is justified in face of evil. Because God doesn't create the world. God limited himself to shape the world.
So yes, is responsible in an indirect way of the evil because it allows the risk of evils, the risk of occurrence of negative events. Yes, it's a risk. Because if you promote the world toward beauty, and if you create ever more free creatures, ever more complex feature, so according to metaphysical correlation, so there is also the risk of suffering ever more pains. So from this point of view, yes, it's responsible for evil. But on the other hand, is unavoidable because there is always been a world that contains beings. So evil doesn't depend on God. It's not an evil choice. It's a God choice, but depends on the choice made by creatures. So the conflict between freedom and the presence of metaphysical correlation. So God is perfectly justified.
But we can also say that this theology is actually an attempt to justify the evil, an attempt to build a new theology exactly for answering to the existential drama of Ivan Karamazov,
Yes.
of the presence of evil. A logic attempt, I don't know if it's true, okay, but maybe we can interpret it as a logic attempt to justify the evil in the presence of evil in the world. I don't know if it feels rightly in the Christian tradition. I have a lot of doubts about it, but I can think about it in that way. But there is still a little curiosity. Some process theologians maybe can have a problem with the second principle of thermodynamics, so the principle of entropy. Because the word, according to this principle, the word, the panentheistic word,
Yeah.
goes into the chaos, goes into the disorder, and not into the harmony of the whole thing.
The ghost words.
The word goes directly into the chaos.
Okay.
The pantheistic word.
Yes, but okay. Yes, it's good. Question.
Panentheistic, sorry.
Yeah, yes, exactly.
So God faced the second principle of thermodynamics.
Because chaos is not finished. Chaos is the basis of the world.
Mm-hmm.
So God continually shaped the world. So its act is not one time for all, but it's continuous act of defeating chaos. So there are these two principles. There is chaos and God can.
Okay, it's a dualistic theology. So
it's
I have some
exactly
doubt about the
dualistic.
Christian fulfillment of this theology.
I
But
understand
okay.
you, but
Yeah, that's the point. It's a dualistic theology.
And so
Okay.
the chaos is co-eternal to God.
Sorry?
The chaos,
Co-eternal.
which is shaped by God in progress.
Yeah.
Eternal like God. It is not something fearful to agnostic vision.
Yeah,
Dualistic
understand you.
vision.
The next time we'll discuss Vito Mancuso conception because it embraces, in my opinion, many process aspects in his theology. And for example, to justify this problem, he said that God created at first chaos and then the world, because chaos was necessary to create a world. Because the principle of chaos is necessary to bring novelty in the world. Without chaos, there is no novelty. And so he tried to resolve this problem, this dualistic, in a creation, in a particular vision, the particular creative view. Okay, it's a big problem for process theology because they say that their vision is semi-dualistic. It's not dualistic, semi-dualistic, and I think that is just attempt to.
How convenient.
Yes, exactly. It's convenient.
But chaos is eternal.
The word is eternal. The word is co-eternal with God. The word. The word.
Chaos is something of numerical.
No. Chaos is the original.
It's
state
the
of
word
the
without
word.
God.
It's the word without exactly. It's the word without God. So in this pantheistic vision, there is God. Inside, there is God, and inside God there is the word. Okay, and the word was in an original state of chaos, but this chaos continually is hard, prompts try to emerge. And so God continually is shape. God intervene every time to bring order. So the world is a messy. It's a big messy. And so God try to bring order.
Sono due principi, non che Dio esce dal caos, non è così, o sì?
No, absolutely.
Okay.
God is, the world is inside God. It's inside God.
Però è caotico.
But in the original state, it's chaotic. And the world and God try to shape, to order it.
Ok, vabbè, lasciamo fare.
From same aspect, yes. For same aspect, yes. Yes, I think yes. I think that nobody, no one of theologians have ever reflected about this. But I think there are some Schelling's influence on this view. Sorry? Yes, Plato's Timaeus is exactly. In fact, they take Timaeus as a point of reference. They quote Plato's Timaeus as a good expression of their position.
Do you know that Parison in Italy?
Sorry?
Parison.
Yeah, I know, Luigi Parison.
Of the bad as something original in God.
Yeah.
In the process theology, this chaos is something of bad in God.
God. Okay. Good question. Chaos is not considered intrinsically evil. Okay. It contains some evil because if God cannot intervene in ordering, then would have been only trivial experience. And so in this meaning is evil, but is not evil in itself. It will be evil if God, God will not intervene.
And Trinity in process theology?
There is Trinity, absolutely. But they change...
But which link between Trinity and chaos?
What do you mean, sorry?
Between...
yes, I understand, but yes, connection, yes, I understand, but do you mean between Logos?
Trinity, Father, Son,
yeah.
and Holy Ghost.
Yeah. Christ is considered with the active work of Holy Spirit, the principle that bring order into chaos. So the Trinity is God in his multiplicity dimension, the multiple dimension that intervene in chaos to shape it. So Christ is the classical example of the creative love of God that intervene in the world directly, sending his Son to bring order in the world, to change the world towards love.
But this is an economic Trinity.
Anti-economic.
And Trinity in itself